The moment the officers stepped into the terminal, the air changed. Conversations thinned into whispers. Phones were raised. Even the rolling suitcases seemed to quiet beneath the weight of what was happening. At the center of it all stood Elijah Carter, a man whose entire empire was built on unshakable composure. Yet in this moment, even he could feel it, the crackling tension that comes when control starts to slip. His gaze flicked to the airline staff behind the counter. Their faces frozen in the kind of forced neutrality people wear when they know they've just made a catastrophic mistake. "Sir, we need to speak with you." The officer's voice was firm, rehearsed, the tone of someone used to being obeyed. Elijah exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to roll his shoulders or show even the slightest crack in his calm. About what exactly? Rachel, the check-in agent who had started all this, crossed her arms with far too much confidence for someone who had no idea who she was dealing with. "He refused to comply with verification procedures," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through glass. The lead officer gave Elijah a once-over. The tailored navy suit, the polished shoes, the gold cufflink catching the light just right. Not the look of a lost, confused traveler. No, this was a man who belonged here, even if no one wanted to admit it. Without breaking eye contact, Elijah slid his hand into his pocket. No sudden moves, just smooth, deliberate control. His phone screen glowed to life, and with a flick of his thumb, he turned it toward them. A name, a number, and a very urgent message chain from Skylinks. "CEO, before you make any decisions," Elijah said, voice like polished steel, "you might want to call her. She's expecting me." Rachel's smirk slipped, just a fraction, but the officer saw it. His radio crackled to life, low murmurs passing between channels, and then the shift. The officer's spine stiffened, his entire posture recalibrating as the message came through. His eyes darted from Elijah to Rachel, and when he spoke again, his tone was different, sharper, directed not at Elijah, but at her. "Sir, we sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. You're free to go." Rachel's face drained to paper white. Tyler, the younger employee beside her, swallowed so hard it was almost audible. Elijah let the silence hang, adjusting his cufflink with the kind of quiet precision that spoke volumes. "I know." And without another word, he picked up his boarding pass, grabbed his carry-on, and strode toward security, leaving nothing but whispers and unraveling reputations in his wake. But what Rachel didn't know, couldn't know, was that 10 minutes from now, high above this very terminal in a glass-walled boardroom, her career would officially cease to exist. Because when the CEO of Skylink heard what just happened, her reaction wasn't just shock, it was fury. And that's just the beginning. Before we go deeper, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And if you live for stories about power, ego, and billion-dollar consequences, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. Because trust me, you're going to want to know how this one ends. Tyler's fingers drummed nervously against the counter, the silence between them growing heavier by the second. Finally, he cleared his throat, voice lower than before. I'm sure it's just a quick verification," he mumbled weakly. Elijah turned his head slowly, fixing Tyler with a gaze so calm it almost felt dangerous. "You and I both know she didn't. Even check the reservation before she called security," Elijah said, his voice smooth, controlled, but carrying a weight Tyler couldn't meet head-on. Tyler dropped his eyes to the counter. "She's just being careful." Elijah's smile didn't touch his eyes. Careful. The word hung in the air, bitter and sharp. That's when Elijah saw them. Two officers moving toward him, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. Every step a drumbeat counting down to a confrontation already written. The terminal seemed to inhale, the noise dimming under the weight of what was about to unfold. Passengers glanced over, curiosity flickering into quiet unease. The lead officer, broad-shouldered, greying at the temples, stopped just short of Elijah. His nameplate read Beckett. The second officer, younger and less certain, stood a step behind. Both of them scanned Elijah like a puzzle they didn't quite trust. Rachel stood tall behind the counter, arms crossed, chin high, her expression carefully blank, but the spark of satisfaction was impossible to miss. She had called them. Now she was watching the consequences. "Sir," Beckett said, voice firm, professional, rehearsed, "we need to conduct a verification. Step aside with us, please." Elijah inhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. He had been here before, not at this exact counter, but in this exact moment. This wasn't about a reservation. This was about his presence. "No," Elijah said, voice even. "You can verify everything you need to, right here." For half a second, Beckett's jaw clenched, barely visible, but Elijah saw it. The refusal had disrupted the script. "It'll only take a minute," Beckett repeated, with a smile just thin enough to cut. The air thickened. Around them, the crowd gathered at a polite distance, not too close, not too far. Some passengers traded glances, some held their phones up, some just watched with the detached familiarity of people who had seen this story before. A woman near the baggage drop gripped her son's hand tighter. She didn't know Elijah, she didn't know the details, but she knew enough to feel fear bloom in her chest. Elijah kept his hands visible, his voice measured, the survival script every black man in a tailored suit learns early. "My first class. Ticket is booked under my corporate account. My name is Elijah Carter. My passport is right there," he said, voice calm, but sharpened steel underneath. "If Rachel had actually checked before calling you, this conversation wouldn't even be happening." Beckett's eyes flicked to Rachel. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. Elijah reached into his jacket with intentional slowness, retrieving a folded letter. The Skylink executive invitation, proof in black and white that Elijah belonged here. Beckett took it, scanned it, then turned away, muttering into his radio. The younger officer stayed put, his posture softening just a fraction. His doubt now impossible to hide. Rachel stood like stone, but her fingers curled against the counter, nails tapping out an anxious rhythm. "Tyler?" He looked like he wanted to melt into the floor, and then the crackle of Beckett's radio. A garbled response. Beckett's mouth pressed into a tight line. He turned back, stiff. "Mr. Carter, your credentials check out. You're free to go." Elijah didn't move. Not at first. He let the words sit there, let everyone feel the silence they left behind. Slowly, he reached for his passport, his fingers closing around it with care so deliberate it was almost ceremonial. He met Beckett's eyes and held them, just long enough to remind the officer exactly who he had just questioned. "Of course, I'm clear," Elijah said quietly. Then he turned to Rachel. She held her ground, but her confidence cracked just slightly around the edges. "Next time," Elijah said, voice soft, razor sharp, "check before you assume." Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it again. Tyler stared at his shoes. Without another word, Elijah straightened his cuffs, picked up his boarding pass, and walked away, the weight of every stare following him to the security line. Behind him, the terminal woke up again. Murmurs spread like wildfire, phones lifted to capture what was left of the moment. And then the unmistakable sound of a video replaying, the incident already hitting timelines. "No way they called security on a man like that," someone muttered. "Not just a man," his friend corrected. "That's Elijah Carter, CEO of Nexus Technologies." The shock rolled through the crowd. They called the cops on a CEO with a first-class ticket, a corporate invite, and a damn passport in hand? They sure did. The airport had seen drama before. But today, Today, it had witnessed something else entirely, not just a mistake, but a moment captured forever, where a black man's success still wasn't enough to buy him the benefit of the doubt. And the story. It was just getting started. Some shook, their heads muttering under their breath about how absurd it was. Others, especially those who had seen this play out before, felt something darker simmering beneath the surface. A white businessman in a tailored blazer frowned at his phone, scrolling through the comments, already flooding the uploaded video. "Same damn story every time," he muttered, almost to himself. A black mother stood nearby, her young son still gripping her hand. She exhaled quietly, brushing a kiss onto his curls. "You see why I tell you to be careful?" Her voice was soft, but the weight behind it was centuries old. The boy nodded, though his wide eyes said he didn't fully understand, at least not yet. A man with noise-canceling headphones slung around his neck gave a sharp, humorless snort. "Bet they thought he scammed his way into first class," he muttered. "'Cause God forbid a black man actually earns his seat, right?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and more than a few pairs of eyes turned toward Rachel and Tyler at the counter, waiting for an explanation. Rachel stiffened, her arms still crossed, fingers digging into her sleeves. Tyler looked worse, his skin pale, his gaze flickering from the check-in screen to Elijah's retreating back and then down to his own hands, like he could will himself. Invisible if he just tried hard enough, Elijah heard every word, felt every shift in the air. He could have kept walking, left it behind, but some part of him wouldn't, not this time. He turned back, Rachel's spine snapped straight, her chin tilting up like she was bracing for impact. Tyler, however, flinched, his shoes scuffed half. A step back before he caught himself. Elijah set his bag down, deliberate and controlled, his fingers resting against the handle. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it didn't need volume to carry weight. "You called security without even looking at my paperwork." Rachel's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Sir, I was following protocol." Her tone was clipped, defensive. Elijah's, head tilted just slightly, gaze sharp. "Protocol," she nodded. "When something seems suspicious, we're trained to alert security." A muscle ticked in his jaw, but his tone stayed even. "What exactly seemed suspicious about me?" Rachel hesitated, and that silence told Elijah everything. Tyler exhaled sharply, still staring at the counter like he was praying for a sinkhole. "None," he mumbled. Rachel's head snapped toward him, but the damage was done. Tyler's face was drawn tight, his knuckles pale where they gripped the counter's edge. He wouldn't look at Elijah, but he couldn't hide from the truth either. Elijah inhaled slowly through his nose, steadying the frustration threatening to surface. He knew no apology was coming, not from Rachel, and probably not from Tyler either. But this moment wasn't just about him. It was about every pair of eyes still watching, every camera still recording, every person who would replay this and remember. He picked up his bag, gave a single nod. "You should think about what you just did." Then he walked away. Even with his back turned, he could feel the weight of it all pressing against his spine, the air thick, the silence louder than any outburst could have been. A young black man near the seating area clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles went white. His jaw was locked, his breathing controlled, but the tension in his shoulders told the real story. His fingers flexed, loosened, then curled again. The anger wasn't just for Elijah, it was for every time it had happened to him, to someone he knew, to someone who looked like him. Nearby, a white man in a grey suit, someone who had seemed detached from it all, was now scrolling through headlines, his brows knitting tighter with every refresh. It was clear, maybe for the first time, that he was connecting the dots, realizing just how often this happens right in front of him, and how rarely he ever noticed. A middle-aged Latina woman stepped forward from the crowd, hesitation flickering across her face before she found her courage. "I've seen this before," she said quietly when Elijah slowed beside her. Her voice held something deeper than sympathy. Understanding. He met her gaze. "My husband's a doctor," she said, swallowing hard. "I've lost count of how many times. People assume he isn't." Her glance flicked toward the counter. "People like her, they never even realize what they're doing. And even if they do, they won't say it out loud." Elijah let out a slow breath. "No," he said softly, "they won't." The woman's smile was small, sad, and exhausted all at once. "At least people are watching now," she said. He glanced around, taking in the faces still turned toward him, the phones tucked away now, but the moment far from forgotten. "I hope so." She gave him one final nod before stepping back, fading into the crowd. Elijah adjusted the strap of his bag and headed toward security, never once looking back at the counter. He didn't need to. The damage was already done. Rachel stood frozen, arms crossed, her fingers gripping her sleeves too tightly. She refused to look at him, but the tension in her posture said it all. She wasn't unaffected, not even close. Tyler looked worse. His shoulders slumped, his expression haunted, like the moment had already settled into his bones. He wouldn't forget this, no matter how much he wanted to. Elijah could have yelled, could have demanded an apology, could have caused a scene. He didn't. He let the silence hang instead, thick, heavy, undeniable, until it settled on Rachel and Tyler like a second skin. "You should really think about what you just did." Rachel flinched, barely, but enough. Then Elijah was gone. Tyler's breath came out shaky, his fingers gripping the counter like it was the only thing holding him upright. His knuckles had gone pale, and for a second, Elijah wondered if the kid even realized he was holding on that tight, like somehow that slab of fake marble could anchor him to a version of reality where this wasn't happening. Elijah let the silence stretch, long and uncomfortable, filling every inch of the space between them. Rachel stood there like a statue, arms crossed so tight her fingers were digging into her sleeves. Her face was set, jaw clenched, like she was daring anyone to question her authority. But her eyes gave her away. Just for a moment. A flicker of guilt, shame maybe, or was it just fear? The fear of being seen for exactly what she'd done. Tyler couldn't even fake composure. His eyes were locked on the counter, not daring to look at Elijah or at the crowd gathering behind him. His shoulders sagged, the weight of his own cowardice settling in, sinking deeper with every second of silence. He looked like a man who had just realized, too late, that the script he'd been handed was all wrong, but Elijah wasn't here for an apology. He didn't expect one. He didn't need one. What he wanted, what he needed, was for them to feel this, to sit in this moment and let it brand itself into their memories. Because the next time a black man in a suit approached their counter, the next time they felt that insidious little whisper, the one that said he doesn't belong here, Elijah wanted this moment to slam into them like a freight train. No excuses. No rewriting history in their heads. He adjusted the strap of his bag, movements calm, deliberate, the kind of control that only comes when you've lived this scene too many times to count. And then, without a word, he turned and walked toward security. Behind him, the terminal came back to life, but not the same life it had before. The air buzzed with whispers, quiet but urgent, conversations laced with shock, frustration, and recognition. Phones were already out, fingers flying over screens, captions being typed in real time, racial profiling at Gate 27. They called security on this man for what? The video was spreading before Elijah even reached the metal detectors. Rachel and Tyler didn't move. They stood frozen behind the counter, stuck in the wreckage they'd created. Rachel's arms stayed crossed, but her stance was brittle now, her shoulders tense under the weight of watching eyes. Tyler. He just looked, wrecked, pale, miserable, like he was praying to disappear into the floor, to be anywhere but here. Elijah never looked back. He didn't need to. The moment was already carved into the bones of that terminal. The damage was done, and this time the world was watching. Elijah's gaze cut across the room like a blade, sharp and deliberate, locking onto Gerald with the kind of quiet force that could silence a room without raising his voice. "We can sit here and talk numbers all day," Elijah said, his voice calm, measured, but now there was something sharper beneath it. A thin wire of tension stretched tight. "We can talk about cash flow and flight paths and digital check-in optimization, but if we don't fix this, if we don't cut out the rot inside this company's culture, none of it will matter." His hand rested flat against the table. Fingers splayed just enough to suggest control, but his eyes burned with something else entirely. "Because your customers notice," he said, his voice dropping just enough to make them lean in. "Your employees notice. And if Skylink can't actually prove, that it stands for something better than this, then no amount of investment, no amount of slick branding, no amount of polished presentations is going to save you." The room froze, the silence, so thick it felt physical. Vanessa inhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, her fingers interlacing with practiced calm. Lillian tapped her pen once, sharp against the table, her face a mask of careful thought, but her eyes flicked back to Elijah, watchful. Some board members shifted in their seats, discomfort rolling through them like a slow wave. Others stared, straight ahead, hoping to avoid being dragged into the spotlight at all. It was Gerald who finally spoke, his voice low, deliberately steady, the voice of a man who had survived his share of corporate fires. "Are you suggesting," Gerald said, "that Skylink has a systemic problem, Mr. Carter?" Elijah didn't blink. "I'm suggesting," he said, voice still smooth but with steel beneath it, "that if we're going to do business together, if I'm going to put my name, my reputation, and my capital into this company, then we need to make damn sure Skylink actually reflects the values it claims to stand for." He leaned back slightly, shoulders square, calm and unshaken. "And that means real action, not a press release, not a polished apology, real action." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Vanessa's lips quirked, just barely, the ghost of approval flickering across her face before her expression smoothed over. "He's right," she said. No hesitation, no second guessing. Her voice carried the weight of a decision already made. "We can't afford to ignore this, not anymore." Gerald's jaw tightened, but his hands stayed folded. The only sign of his frustration was the way his fingers pressed into each other, just a little too hard. And then, a sharp vibration cut through the silence. Everyone's gaze flicked toward Vanessa's phone, face down on the table, the soft hum like a thin crack running through the moment. She didn't look at it at first, her focus still locked on Elijah. But the phone buzzed again, urgent, insistent. She glanced down. Her face didn't change, not at first, but Elijah saw it, the flicker. The smallest shift at the edges of her expression, like a door cracking open, just enough to let something cold slip through. Without a word, she turned the phone over and opened the email. A red flag at the top marked it urgent. Elijah saw her. Inhale. So subtle most people would miss it, but Elijah didn't miss much. "Elijah," she said, voice tight, "you need to see this." She turned the screen toward him. He read the subject line first. Unspoken passenger vetting, priority alert. His name was in the body of the email. The cold weight hit his stomach first, then spread out, slow and steady, until it settled in his chest. It was the kind of weight that came with confirmation, the moment your suspicions became evidence, inked into company policy. The email wasn't long. It didn't need to be. In accordance with our unspoken passenger vetting system, certain individuals should be flagged for priority screening at check-in. If any name on this list appears in our system, staff should proceed with additional verification measures to ensure security compliance. His name was second on the list. Elijah leaned back, exhaling slow through his nose, keeping his face neutral. But something deep inside him coiled tight. He already knew. He knew. From the moment Rachel's eyes flicked up at the counter. From the way her shoulders squared like she was preparing for confrontation before he even said hello. From the way security showed up without a single question asked. But knowing and seeing it in writing, that was different. That was proof. Vanessa's fingers curled slightly against the table, the tension radiating through her body. She was still staring at the screen like she could will it into disappearing. This, she said quietly, was never supposed to exist. Elijah let out a low, humorless laugh. And yet, he said, here we are. Gerald's face didn't shift, but his posture stiffened, the stiffness of a man trying not to react. Where did that come from? Gerald asked, voice clipped. Vanessa scrolled. Anonymous tip, she said, leaked from inside the company. Looks like someone forwarded it from an internal chain. Whoever sent it didn't want their name attached. Elijah watched her closely. But you knew, he said. On some level you knew something like this existed. Her gaze didn't waver. Not officially, she said. But I've been hearing rumors for months. Internal profiling methods. Whispered about, but never in writing. Because that's how it works, Elijah said, voice even. You keep it off the books. Make it an unwritten policy. That way, when it blows up, you get to act shocked. You get to say, that's not who we are. Vanessa's jaw tightened, not at him but at the truth of it. Elijah shifted his gaze to the rest of the board. Gerald, fingers steepled like a judge on his bench. Lillian, her pen hovering. Mid-air, eyes darting between the email and Vanessa, already calculating fallout. The others, uncomfortable, silent, wanting to vanish into their expensive suits. I assume, Elijah said softly, I'm not the only name on that list. Vanessa didn't answer. She didn't have to. And I assume, Elijah added, that list is mostly people who look like me. No one spoke. That silence was the answer. The weight of it settled over the table, heavy and undeniable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't one employee making a bad call. This was the system, humming quietly beneath the surface, woven into the very bones of Skylink. Vanessa inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around her phone. Whoever leaked this, she said, her voice low but dangerous, just dropped a live grenade in the middle of this company. Elijah's gaze didn't move from hers. Then the only question left, he said, is what you're going to do about it. He finally looked up, his gaze finding Elijah's across the table. And this time, he didn't look away. I was wrong, Tyler said. Rachel scoffed softly, the sound sharp enough to cut through the silence. Unbelievable, she muttered under her breath. Vanessa's gaze flicked toward her, her voice as sharp as steel. Do you have something to say? Rachel pressed her lips together for half a second before straightening her spine, folding her hands neatly in front of her like a shield. Her posture was rigid, her voice crisp. I followed procedure, she said again, as if repetition alone could make it true. Vanessa's jaw flexed. And what exactly was suspicious about Mr. Carter? Rachel hesitated, just for a heartbeat. But it was enough. Vanessa didn't blink, didn't let her off the hook. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, but slicing through the air like a scalpel. Did you think I had a fake passport? Rachel didn't answer. Did you think I was lying about my flight plans? Still silence. Or did you just think a black man in first class didn't belong? Rachel's nostrils flared slightly, her face tight, but her silence was louder than any excuse she could have offered. Say it, Elijah said quietly. Rachel swallowed hard, her fingers curling against the edge of the table. She stopped, her throat working, words catching before they could form. Finally, she exhaled, her voice thin. I did what I was trained to do. Vanessa shook her head, disgust flickering across her face. No, you didn't. Rachel frowned. Excuse me, there's nothing in our training materials that says a well-dressed businessman with proper identification and a first-class ticket should be flagged for security, Vanessa said, her voice cold enough to frost glass. There's nothing in our policy that says we assume guilt before checking facts, so don't sit there and try to hide behind procedure. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You didn't follow company policy. You followed your own. Rachel's expression didn't crack, but something behind her eyes flickered, a flash of something raw and uncomfortable. Vanessa straightened, her gaze sweeping between both of them. You both had choices in that moment, she said, voice still razor-sharp. Rachel, you chose to escalate before verifying. Tyler, you chose to stay silent rather than question it. She shook her head slowly, as though the weight of their decisions was physically exhausting. And now the entire company is going to pay the price. Tyler swallowed hard, shame crawling up his neck like heat. Rachel's expression stayed, locked in that same tight mask, unreadable but brittle at the edges. Elijah's voice cut through the silence again, quieter now, but no less commanding. I want to be very clear about something. The room leaned in, held captive by the weight of what they already knew was coming. You didn't just humiliate me. You didn't just make a bad judgment call, Elijah said. You contributed to a system that has real consequences. Do you know how many times situations like this don't end with a boardroom discussion? Do you know how many times people like me are dragged off flights, detained, arrested, or worse? Rachel looked away, her jaw clenched so tight, the muscle twitched. You ever stop to think what it's like to live your life expecting it, knowing that no matter how much success you earn, no matter how many deals you close, no matter how many seats at the table you take, someone like you will always be waiting to remind me I don't really belong? The silence after that was suffocating. Vanessa inhaled slowly, then pressed her hands against the table as she stood. Rachel, she said, voice clipped and final, you're fired, effective immediately. Rachel's head snapped up. I can't be serious. Watch me. There was no argument left to make. Rachel sat frozen for a moment, lips parted like she wanted to fight, but the words didn't come. Because she knew. She knew. Tyler's breath came out uneven. He didn't look relieved, just resigned. Vanessa turned to him. You're on probation, full bias training performance review, and if I so much as hear a whisper that you've made another bad call, you're done. Tyler nodded quickly. I understand. Vanessa's gaze swept over both of them one last time, cold and cutting. Now get out of my sight. Rachel stood stiffly, grabbing her things without a word. Tyler followed, his head low, his steps heavy. The door shut behind them, leaving only silence in their wake. Vanessa exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Unbelievable. Elijah leaned back in his chair, slow and deliberate. Believe it. The tension didn't break. It only thickened, wrapping around the room like smoke. Lillian Cho, who had been silent through most of the meeting, was now typing furiously into her tablet, her brows knit together in concentration. Where are we on the internal audit? Vanessa asked, her patience frayed. Lillian barely looked up. I traced the email. The leak came from inside our system. We should have the source in a few minutes. Elijah watched Vanessa closely. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the slight curl of her fingers against the table. This wasn't just a PR nightmare. This was a reckoning, and it was happening under her roof. A sharp knock on the glass door broke the silence. A man with a headset and an IT badge stepped in, tablet in hand, expression neutral, but his grip tight. He placed it in front of Vanessa. "We found it." She glanced down and froze. The sender, Daniel Walsh. The air shifted. Board members stiffened, exchanging wary glances, but Daniel himself didn't move, didn't blink. He just adjusted his cufflinks and leaned back like he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Vanessa's voice was quieter now, but sharpened to a point. "Tell me, Daniel, how long have you been running this little operation?" Daniel exhaled, a low, humorless chuckle escaping his throat. "Let's not get dramatic." "Oh, I think dramatic is exactly the right word," Vanessa said. "One of my board members issued a racial profiling directive, then acted shocked when it blew up in his face." Daniel shrugged, casual to the point of insult. "It wasn't a directive, it was a recommendation." Elijah arched a brow. "A recommendation? Let's be honest," Daniel said, finally turning toward Elijah. "Airlines vet passengers all the time. Every major company has security protocols. Some are just more specific than others." Elijah's fingers tapped once against the table. "Specific?" Daniel didn't blink. "If you're asking whether I think additional screening for certain demographics makes sense, then yes, I do. If you're asking whether I regret how Rachel handled it, sure. Maybe I'd have told her to be a little more subtle." Vanessa's jaw twitched. "You don't even sound sorry." Daniel shook his head. "The real problem isn't what I did, it's that I got caught." The silence was deafening. Elijah let the words settle, let the board sit with them, let them understand exactly who they'd been sitting next to all this time. Vanessa straightened, pushed her chair back, and stood. "You're done," she said, voice flat and final. "Effective immediately." Daniel tilted his head, studying her, searching for hesitation. But there was none. "You can't be serious." Vanessa's smile was all teeth. "Oh, I'm deadly." "Serious?" Vanessa extended her hand. "Badge." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. When Vanessa glanced at the IT specialist, her voice was firm. "Revoke his system access. Now." The specialist tapped his tablet, and a few seconds later, Daniel's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced down, swiped the screen, then barked out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Just like that?" Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. "Just like that." Daniel's smirk twisted into something uglier. He turned to the rest of the board. "You think firing me fixes this? The media already has it. The public knows exactly what kind of company you're running." He leaned back, shaking his head. "You can throw me under the bus, Vanessa, but it won't change a damn thing." Elijah spoke then, his voice low, cutting through the silence like a knife. "No," he said, "but it's a start." Daniel's cocky facade cracked just a little as he turned to Elijah, seeing him for the first time as a real threat. Vanessa stood. "Security's waiting outside. You can walk out or they'll walk you out. Your choice." Daniel pushed back from the table, rising slowly, scanning the room like he was memorizing faces. Then he shook his head and muttered, "You're making a mistake," before stalking toward the door. No one stopped him. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Vanessa exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. "Jesus Christ!" Elijah watched her, calm and steady. Now the real work begins. Even with Daniel gone, the weight of his actions hung in the air like smoke after a fire. This wasn't just about him or Rachel or even Tyler. This was about the culture they'd all let fester. Vanessa's voice cut through the quiet. "Lillian, full compliance audit, effective immediately. I want to know if there are more Daniels hiding in this company. If they exist, we find them before they ruin us." Lillian nodded, already tapping out messages. Vanessa turned to Elijah. "We'll fix this." This time her voice held something more than frustration. It held resolve. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then prove it." Outside the boardroom, security was already escorting Daniel down the hallway. His usual swagger was dulled, though not gone entirely. He still walked like a man who believed he'd land on his feet. Rachel wasn't so composed. She stood near reception, arms crossed, so tightly her knuckles turned white. The HR rep spoke in calm, clinical tones. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. Your final paycheck will be processed within the next cycle. Your belongings will be shipped to your listed address. Security will escort you out. Rachel's face was a mask, but her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "You're making a mistake," she muttered, echoing Daniel's words. "I was doing my job." The HR rep didn't blink. "Your actions violated company policy and exposed us to legal liability. The decision is final." Rachel spun on her heel, heels clicking sharp against the marble floor. Her back was ramrod straight, fury radiating off her like heat. A few feet away, Tyler stood frozen, pale and shaking. "Tyler!" He stepped forward, hands trembling as the HR rep addressed him. "You will be placed on probation, subject to mandatory bias training, compliance oversight, and strict monitoring of all customer interactions. One misstep and your employment is terminated." Tyler's head bobbed quickly. "I understand." From a distance, Elijah watched it all, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. This wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a start. A month later, Elijah stepped into Hartsfield-Jackson International. The same terminal, the same check-in counter, but everything felt different. The staff worked with quiet efficiency, no glances, no whispered judgments, just professionalism, the way it should have been all along. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," the agent greeted him, smile warm but respectful. "Checking in for New York?" He nodded. "That's right." She found his reservation quickly, her demeanor calm, her attention undivided. "You're all set. Anything else you need?" Elijah held her gaze a beat longer than necessary, searching for cracks, but there were none. "I'm good, thank you." As he reached for his boarding pass, movement caught his eye. Tyler, the younger man, stood a few feet away, nervous but grounded in a way Elijah hadn't seen before. "Mr. Carter." Tyler's voice was hesitant. Elijah exhaled, slipping his boarding pass into his pocket. "Tyler." "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from," Tyler said, voice tight with guilt. "But I'm sorry, not just for that day, for standing there and letting it happen." He swallowed hard. "I've been through the training, the reviews, and I get it now. I get how easy it is to stay quiet, how easy it is to let someone else pay the price for your silence." His voice cracked slightly. "But I don't want to be that guy anymore." Elijah studied him, saying nothing. Apologies didn't erase humiliation, exhaustion, or the armor you had to build just to walk through the world, but it was something. "It's never too late to be better," Elijah said quietly. Tyler's shoulders sagged in relief, and Elijah gave him a small nod before turning toward security. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Skylink didn't just issue a boilerplate statement and move on. They couldn't afford to. The scandal was too loud, too public. This time they acted. Mandatory anti-bias training rolled out company-wide, from the C-suite to the baggage handlers. Employees who used to dismiss conversations about racism were now sitting through immersive workshops, face-to-face with the footage of Elijah's humiliation. They couldn't look away. Rachel was gone, but the culture that created her, that was the real fight. Vanessa led a full review, hiring, promotions, disciplinary processes, all dragged into the light. No more burying complaints in HR's filing cabinet. Every case was tracked, investigated with real consequences. The secret passenger vetting process, dead, permanently erased. But the most striking change was Vanessa herself, standing before cameras, no teleprompter, no spin, just truth. "What happened to Mr. Carter wasn't isolated," she said, voice steady. "It was a symptom of a broken system, one we are committed to fixing, not with words, but with action." Some people were skeptical. They'd seen apologies before. But as weeks passed, change actually happened, and people noticed. Elijah saw it all from a distance. He had no interest in being Skylink's redemption mascot. This wasn't about him. It never was. It was about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. Every person forced to prove their worth just to exist in spaces others took for granted. On the plane, Elijah settled into his seat. Across the aisle, a man in a sharp navy blazer glanced over. "You're Elijah Carter, right?" Elijah smiled, faintly. "Depends which video you're talking about," the man chuckled. "The one where you got treated like a criminal and still kept your cool." He shook his head, expression thoughtful. "I don't think I could have handled it the way you did." Elijah looked out the window, the runway stretching ahead. "You don't fight fire with fire," he said. "You fight it with something stronger. Justice." The engines roared and the plane lifted off. The world wasn't fixed, not even close. But today was a little better than yesterday. Now the real question, what would you have done if you were there? This isn't just a story. This is reality. Every day in airports, boardrooms, stores, streets, the question isn't if racism still exists. The question is, what are you going to do about it? What's your story? Share it. Speak up. Because silence is complicity, and respect should never be a privilege. It should be the standard.